I stood on the worn wooden porch of the house my father had built with his own two hands in a quiet suburb of Ohio, staring at the bright red for sale sign that felt like a tombstone marking the end of my family's legacy. This house was more than just wood and nails. It was the smell of my mother's Sunday pot roast, the height marks carved into the kitchen doorframe, and the only piece of my parents I had left after the car accident took them 3 years ago. Now I was preparing to sign it away, to hand the keys to a stranger just to keep my wife, Mia, from spending the rest of her life in a wheelchair. 2 weeks ago, my world had been perfect, or at least I thought it was, until that Tuesday night when the local police knocked on my door to tell me Mia had been involved in a horrific hit-and-run just 3 blocks from our home. They told me she had been found crumpled in the gutter, her legs shattered and her spirit broken. When I rushed to the hospital, the sight of her nearly stopped my heart. She was a pale, fragile shadow of the vibrant woman I married, her legs encased in massive casts and connected to a web of pulleys and weights. The doctors at the private clinic where she'd been moved, led by the prestigious Dr. Sterling, were blunt about the situation. They said the damage was catastrophic, requiring a series of experimental surgeries and a long-term rehabilitation plan that the insurance company was already labeling as elective and refusing to cover. Dr. Sterling, a man with a silver tongue and a bedside manner that felt like warm honey, looked me in the eye and told me that without these procedures, Mia would never walk again. The cost was astronomical, a mountain of debt that loomed over us like a dark cloud, and with our savings already depleted from our recent wedding, I had only one card left to play: my inheritance. I spent every waking second at Mia's bedside, barely eating and sleeping in a cramped plastic chair, feeding her spoonfuls of lukewarm soup and whispering promises that everything would be okay. Mia would cry for hours, her voice a ragged sob as she told me she felt like a burden, begging me not to sell the house while simultaneously gripping my hand so hard her knuckles turned white. She seemed so helpless, so utterly destroyed by the accident, that I would have done anything to take away her pain. I had the real estate agent on speed dial, the papers for the house sale sitting on the bedside table next to her morphine drip, just waiting for my final signature to trigger the escrow process. I felt like a hero, the doting husband sacrificing everything for love, and I didn't question a single thing Dr. Sterling told me. But then came the shift change that changed my life. It was a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after the accident, and the hospital was quiet, bathed in the eerie blue glow of the hallway monitors. I was heading to the vending machine for another cup of bitter coffee when a young nurse named Sarah, someone I'd seen hovering in the background, but who never spoke more than a few words to me, suddenly brushed past me in the narrow corridor. It wasn't a clumsy accident. She practically slammed into me, her shoulder hitting mine with enough force to make me stumble. Before I could even open my mouth to apologize, I felt her small, cold hand shove a crumpled scrap of paper into my hoodie pocket. I looked up, but she was already walking away, her head down and her pace frantic. The look in her eyes for that split second was burned into my mind. It wasn't just stress or fatigue. It was pure, unadulterated terror. My heart started to race as I ducked into the men's restroom and locked the door, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I pulled the paper from my pocket, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely unfold it. There were only 4 words written in frantic, messy ink. Check the security cameras. At first, I was confused, my mind racing through possibilities. Did they make a mistake with her medication? Was Dr. Sterling hiding a complication? I thought maybe it was a prank or a disgruntled employee trying to cause trouble, but the image of Sarah's terrified face wouldn't let me go. I stayed in that stall for what felt like hours, the silence of the restroom amplified by the thudding of my pulse in my ears. I looked at the note again, the ink slightly smeared as if it had been written in a hurry. I realized then that I couldn't just ignore it. If there was even a 1% chance that something wasn't right, I owed it to Mia and to the memory of my parents to find out the truth before I signed away their home. I waited until the night shift settled in and the hallways were empty before I made my way down to the basement of the clinic where the security office was located. I felt like a criminal, sneaking through the shadows of the building I had spent so much time in as a grieving husband. The air in the basement was colder, smelling of floor wax and stale air, and every click of my shoes on the linoleum sounded like a gunshot. I had no idea that the moment I opened that door, the life I thought I was living would vanish. I had no idea that the person I loved most in the world was currently sitting in a hospital bed, playing the role of a victim in a plot so twisted it felt like a cheap movie script. As I reached for the handle of the security room, I took one last deep breath of the sterile hospital air, not knowing that it was the last time I would ever feel like the man I used to be. The betrayal was waiting for me behind that door, recorded in high definition on a digital loop, and once I saw it, there would be no going back. I pushed the door open, my hand trembling, ready to confront a ghost I didn't even know existed. While upstairs, my wife was likely waiting for me to return with the news that our future was finally sold to the highest bidder. The memory of that phone call still haunts my dreams, like a recurring nightmare that refuses to fade into the morning light. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of mundane, drizzly night where you're more worried about a leaky faucet or what to pick up for dinner than the total collapse of your reality. I was in the kitchen, half listening to the local news and thinking about how much Mia would love the pasta I was making, when my cell phone vibrated against the granite countertop with a violent buzz that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was one I would never forget. Cold, professional, and carrying the weight of 1,000 tragedies. They told me there had been an accident, a hit and run just blocks away, and that my wife was being rushed to the trauma unit at the Sterling Clinic. I don't remember the drive there. It's a blur of red lights I ignored, and a pulse that sounded like a drumbeat of panic in my ears. When I burst through those sliding glass doors, the smell of antiseptic and floor wax hit me like a physical blow, a scent that would eventually become the permanent backdrop of my life for the next 14 days. I found Mia in a room that felt too small for the amount of equipment surrounding her. She was wrapped in bandages from the waist down, her legs encased in heavy, immobile structures that looked more like medieval torture devices than modern medical equipment. Her face was pale, almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights, and her eyes were wide with a terror that looked so real it made my own breath hitch. Through her sobbing, she kept repeating the same haunting phrase over and over. "I can't feel my feet, David. I can't feel anything." I felt like I was drowning in a sea of helplessness as I gripped her hand, promising her that we would fix this, that I would do whatever it took to make her whole again. That's when Dr. Sterling stepped into the room, radiating an aura of expensive education and unshakable confidence. He pulled me into the hallway, his face a mask of practiced concern as he explained the catastrophic nature of the injury. He used words like spinal shock and complex comminuted fractures, painting a picture of a woman whose life had been shattered into a million pieces. Then came the number. He didn't blink when he told me the specialized surgeries and long-term care would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, money we didn't have, Money the insurance company was already looking for excuses not to pay. He looked me dead in the eye and said that every hour we waited was an hour of potential nerve death, essentially putting a ticking clock on my wife's ability to ever walk again. I didn't hesitate. Not for a single second. I had the house my parents had worked 40 years to pay off, a beautiful craftsman home that held every memory of my childhood and represented the only real security I had in the world. I told him I'd sell it. I'd sell my car. I'd sell my soul if that's what it took to get Mia back on her feet. Over the next 2 weeks, the hospital room became my entire world. I lived out of a backpack and slept in a plastic chair that felt like it was designed to keep you in a state of perpetual discomfort. I barely ate, surviving on vending machine granola bars and the sheer adrenaline of desperation. I became Mia's shadow, feeding her spoonfuls of lukewarm broth, adjusting her pillows, and reading to her until my voice went hoarse. Every time I mentioned the house or the progress of the sale, she would break down in fresh waves of tears. She'd tell me she felt like a monster for letting me give up my inheritance, that she didn't deserve a husband like me, and that she wished the car had just finished the job so I wouldn't have to suffer. Her guilt felt so genuine, so crushing, that it only fueled my resolve to be her savior. I felt like a hero in a tragic epic, sacrificing my past to secure her future. But the atmosphere in the clinic started to feel heavy, almost oppressive. I noticed the way some of the staff looked at me, not with pity, but with something that looked more like suppressed anxiety. Then came the moment with Sarah, the quiet nurse who had been working the late-night rotations. I was walking back from a brief, dizzying trip to the parking lot for fresh clothes when she passed me in a narrow stretch of the hallway. She didn't slow down, but as our shoulders brushed, I felt her fingers press a small, crumpled square of paper into my palm. The look she gave me wasn't one of care. It was a look of warning, her eyes darting toward the security cameras mounted in the corners of the ceiling before she vanished around a corner. I waited until I was back in Mia's room, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest as she drifted in a morphine-induced sleep before I dared to look at the note. 4 words scrawled in a frantic, shaky hand. Check the security cameras. My first instinct was confusion, then a sudden, sharp spike of paranoia. Was there a mistake in her chart? Was someone stealing medication? I couldn't shake the image of Sarah's face. She looked like someone who was holding a bomb and didn't know where to put it. I sat in the dark for an hour, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor sounding like a countdown. I looked at Mia, her beautiful face framed by the white hospital pillow, and I felt a pang of betrayal just for doubting the reality of our situation. But the seed was planted, and it grew with every passing minute of silence. I knew I couldn't just sit there and wait for the sun to come up. I needed to know what a terrified nurse thought was so important that she would risk her career to tell me. I waited until the 2 a.m. shift change, when the hallways were at their most deserted and the nightlights were dimmed to a ghostly blue. I slipped out of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I was sure the nurses at the station could hear it. I avoided the main elevators, taking the service stairs down to the basement, a place where the air felt 5 degrees colder and smelled of damp concrete and industrial cleaning fluid. Every shadow seemed to stretch out toward me, and every hum of the building's ventilation system sounded like a whispered secret. I found the door marked Security Operations, a heavy steel slab that stood between me and a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to handle. My hand hovered over the handle, trembling with the weight of what I was about to do. I was a man about to sell his parents' legacy for the woman he loved, But as I stood in that cold basement, I felt like a man walking onto a gallows. I took a deep breath, pushing the door open, unaware that the flickering monitors inside were about to show me a version of my wife that didn't exist in the room upstairs. I was looking for answers, but I was about to find a betrayal so deep it would make the car accident look like a mercy. The door to the security office creaked on its hinges, a low metallic groan that sounded like a warning as I stepped into the cramped, windowless room. The air inside was thick with the hum of servers and the smell of stale coffee and ozone, a stark contrast to the sterile, bleach-scented hallways above. Miller, the night guard, was a guy I'd known through a mutual friend back in high school, a man of few words who owed my buddy a series of favors that I was currently cashing in. He didn't ask questions when I showed up at his door at 3 a.m, with bloodshot eyes and a trembling note in my hand. He just nodded, pulled a rolling chair over, and gestured for me to sit. The glow from the wall of monitors reflected off his glasses as he began to navigate the digital archives, the blue light making my skin look as sickly as I felt. We started 48 hours back, right around the time I had first started talking to the real estate agent about the bridge loan. For the first hour of viewing, I saw exactly what I expected to see. There I was, a ghost of a man, sitting in that same plastic chair, holding Mia's hand while she appeared to drift in and out of a painful sleep. I watched myself lean over to kiss her forehead, watched myself pray with my head bowed, and watched the nurses come in to check her vitals. It was heartbreaking to see my own devotion from a bird's-eye view, knowing how much I was willing to lose. But then, we reached the footage from yesterday morning, specifically the 20-minute window when I had finally succumbed to exhaustion and headed down to the cafeteria to get a coffee and clear my head. On the screen, I watched the digital version of myself walk out of the room and close the heavy oak door behind me. I waited for the feed to show Mia sleeping peacefully, but what happened next felt like a physical strike to my solar plexus, knocking every bit of air from my lungs. The second the door clicked shut, the woman I thought was paralyzed, the woman who had been sobbing for 2 weeks about never being able to dance again, suddenly threw the heavy white covers off her body with a violent, athletic grace. There was no hesitation, no wincing in pain, and certainly no shattered bones. Mia swung her legs over the side of the bed, her movements fluid and practiced, and she didn't just stand up. She practically bounced onto the floor. I watched, paralyzed with a sickening mix of horror and disbelief, as she stretched her arms over her head, her back arching in a way that should have been impossible for someone with a fractured spine. She walked across the room with a confident, rhythmic stride, heading straight for the mini-fridge in the corner. She pulled out a turkey sandwich I'd bought for her earlier, the one she told me she was too nauseous to eat, and started devouring it while leaning casually against the counter. She looked completely different. The pale, fragile victim was gone, replaced by a woman who looked bored and annoyed. Then, she reached under the mattress, pulled out a hidden cell phone, and started dialing while laughing through a mouthful of food. The audio on the clinic's high-end security system was terrifyingly clear, capturing every word of her betrayal in high definition. She was talking to someone named Derek, her cousin who I'd always thought was a bit of a loser, but harmless. A moment later, the door to her room opened and Derek himself walked in, looking over his shoulder before closing it behind him. The two of them didn't embrace in a moment of shared grief. They shared a celebratory high five that echoed through the small security room speakers like a gunshot. Mia started complaining, her voice sharp and mocking as she imitated my concerned tone, telling Derek that I wasn't signing the house papers fast enough. She called me a slow-moving, emotional wreck, and joked about how easy it was to keep me in line with a few well-timed tears and a mention of her shattered future. As I watched, the scope of the conspiracy began to unfurl like a poisonous flower. They weren't talking about surgery or recovery. They were talking about the closing date on my parents' house and how much the sharks were demanding for the vig. It turned out the sweet, innocent woman I had married had a secret life, a gambling addiction that had spiraled so far out of control she owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to people who didn't take "I'm sorry" for an answer. She had lost it all on high-stakes underground poker games and bad sports bets. And when the loan sharks started making threats against her life, she didn't come to me for help. She decided to harvest me for parts. My inheritance, the house that represented my family's entire history, was nothing more than a chip on a table to her. But the most devastating revelation came when Dr. Sterling's name was mentioned. Mia laughed as she told Derek how much of a cut the good doctor was taking for his part in the performance. Sterling wasn't just a specialist. He was a silent partner in the scam, using his medical credentials to provide the fake accident reports and the necessary expensive treatments that would justify the liquidation of my assets. He was getting a massive kickback to play the role of the authoritative expert, ensuring that I never questioned the validity of the medical emergency. I sat there in the dark, watching my wife do literal jumping jacks to get the blood flowing after laying still for so long, and I felt something inside me go cold and hard. The grief that had been consuming me for 2 weeks vanished, replaced by a white-hot, calculating rage that I didn't know I was capable of. I realized that every tear she shed, every "I love you" she whispered in the dark, and every fearful look she gave the shattered legs under the blanket was part of a rehearsed script designed to bankrupt me. She wasn't a victim of a hit and run. She was the architect of a professional-grade con. Miller looked over at me, his face pale and full of a pity that I no longer wanted or needed. He asked if I wanted him to call the police right then, but I shook my head, my eyes never leaving the screen where Mia was now sitting back on the bed, carefully rearranging the bandages to look authentic just moments before I was due to return. I realized then that if I just called the cops now, she'd find a way to spin it, or Dr. Sterling would use his influence to bury the evidence. No, I didn't just want her caught. I wanted her to feel the exact moment her world collapsed, just like I was feeling now. I had spent 2 weeks being the doting, desperate husband, and for the next few days, I was going to give the performance of a lifetime. I would play the fool. I would act like I was finalizing the sale, and I would lead them all right into a trap they never saw coming. I asked Miller to burn the last 48 hours of footage onto a secure drive and to keep his mouth shut for just a little longer. As I walked out of that basement and back toward the elevators, the morning sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the hospital grounds. I looked like the same broken man who had walked in, but inside, I was already building the gallows for the woman I used to love. I walked back into her room, watched her pretend to wake up in agony, and when she reached for my hand and told me she loved me, I didn't flinch. I just smiled, kissed her forehead, and told her that the house sale was almost complete, knowing that every word out of my mouth was a nail in the coffin of her freedom. My first instinct when I stepped out of that cold security office was to tear the door to Mia's room off its hinges and scream until my lungs gave out. But a dark, calculating part of my brain took over, whispering that a simple confrontation wasn't enough for a betrayal of this magnitude. I didn't just want a fight. I wanted a conviction that would ensure she could never do this to anyone else. I had to be smarter than them, more patient than the loan sharks, and more convincing than the doctor who had turned his medical degree into a license to steal. So I took a deep breath of the sterile hospital air and forced my face into the mask of the grieving, desperate husband they expected to see. I called my oldest friend, Marcus, who practiced high-stakes litigation in the city, and a private investigator he recommended named Elias, a man whose voice sounded like gravel and who didn't ask a single question once I told him I needed a deep dive into Dr. Sterling's financial records and my wife's recent movements. Within 24 hours, the house of cards began to collapse in spectacular fashion as the paper trail they thought was hidden started to bleed through the cracks. Elias found that the accident wasn't even on the police scanners that night. There was no 911 call from a bystander, no ambulance dispatched to the scene, and no wreckage found on the street where she was supposedly struck. Instead, security footage from a nearby CVS showed Mia walking perfectly fine toward the clinic, meeting Derek in the parking lot, and then entering the emergency room through a side door where Dr. Sterling was conveniently waiting to admit her without the usual triage protocols. It was a surgical strike on my life, a perfectly choreographed performance where every tear she shed was a line in a script they had been rehearsing for weeks. The deeper Elias dug, the uglier it got. Dr. Sterling wasn't just some greedy surgeon. He was a man drowning in his own malpractice settlements and a lifestyle he couldn't afford. And he had turned the clinic into a mill for insurance fraud and wealthy mark extraction. He was slated to receive a 40% kickback from the experimental treatments that were really just bags of saline and vitamin B12, all funded by the sale of my parents' Craftsman home. But the most chilling discovery was the reality of the loan sharks. They weren't just a plot point to make me feel sorry for her. They were very real and very dangerous. Elias tracked Mia's digital footprint to a series of offshore betting sites and underground casinos in the city where she had burned through our joint savings and then some. She had gambled away our future on high-stakes poker and bad horse racing tips, and when the money ran out, she had turned to people who broke bones instead of hearts. She was desperate, not for my love or for her health, but for the equity sitting in a house she had never truly respected. For the next 48 hours, I lived in a state of dual consciousness, playing the role of the doting, broken husband by day, while coordinating with the police and the district attorney's office by night. I sat by her bed and held her hand, feeling a wave of literal nausea every time her skin touched mine, knowing that the woman I was comforting was currently plotting how to split my inheritance with a crooked doctor. When she would whimper in pain or complain about the phantom tingling in her legs, I would stroke her hair and tell her that the realtor was finalizing the papers, watching the predatory gleam of excitement in her eyes that she tried so hard to hide behind a mask of exhaustion. I spent my coffee breaks in the back of a blacked-out police van 2 blocks away, handing over the security footage Miller had given me, the bank records Elias had unearthed, and a recording of a phone call I'd intercepted between Mia and Derek, where she joked about how I was too stupid for my own good, and how they'd be on a beach in Tulum as soon as the escrow cleared. The detectives were floored by the sheer audacity of the scam, and they helped me set the stage for the final act. I had to keep the real estate agent in the loop, pretending to go through with the sale while secretly ensuring that not a single document was legally binding. It was the most exhausting performance of my life, acting like a man on the brink of losing everything while actually being the one holding all the cards. I watched Dr. Sterling do his rounds, his expensive silk tie and arrogant smirk making my skin crawl, as he patted my shoulder and told me I was doing the right thing for Mia's future. I wanted to break his jaw right there in the hallway, but I just nodded and thanked him, playing the part of the grateful Mark until the very last second. Every time I looked at the "for sale" sign on my phone's lock screen, I reminded myself that this wasn't just about the money. It was about the memory of my parents and the sanctity of the home they had built with love. A home that Mia was willing to burn down to pay for a gambling habit she didn't have the courage to admit. By the second night, the police had enough evidence for multiple counts of insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit grand larceny, and medical malpractice. They wanted to move in quietly, but I convinced them to let me lead the way. I needed to see the look on her face when she realized the idiot husband had outplayed her at her own game. I prepared the closing papers for the house, which were actually printed summaries of the police evidence and stills from the security footage of her walking. I made sure the hallway was staged with plainclothes officers, and I invited Dr. Sterling to be present for the final signing under the guise of him needing to witness the financial commitment for the next stage of her surgery. The air in the hospital room was thick with anticipation on that final morning, the smell of breakfast trays and floor wax mixing with the electric tension of a trap about to snap shut. Mia was sitting up in bed, her face a masterpiece of manufactured fragility, while Derek stood in the corner like a vulture waiting for a carcass. They thought they were minutes away from a payday that would solve all their problems and leave me with nothing but a plastic chair and a pile of debt. They had no idea that the audience was packed, the cameras were rolling, and the final performance was about to begin. And this time, the script didn't end with her walking away. I felt a strange sense of calm as I walked into the room with the folder tucked under my arm, a man who had already mourned the wife he thought he had, and was now ready to meet the monster she actually was. The house wasn't for sale anymore, but her freedom certainly was, and the price was going to be higher than she ever imagined. The morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds in sharp, clinical slats of light that felt like bars on a cage. But for the first time in 2 weeks, I wasn't the one trapped inside of them. I walked into Mia's room with a heavy leather folder tucked under my arm, my footsteps silent on the linoleum floor that had become the ground zero of my life's greatest betrayal. The room was deathly quiet, save for the rhythmic lying beep of the heart monitor and the soft rustle of the sheets as Mia adjusted her position to look more pathetic. She saw the folder, and her eyes immediately welled up with those practiced, diamond-bright tears that used to make my heart ache, but now only made my skin crawl with a cold, detached revulsion. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers searching for mine, and when she squeezed my hand, she whispered that I was her guardian angel, the only man in the world who would sacrifice everything to save her. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a performance so polished that if I hadn't seen the footage, I would have been on my knees begging for her forgiveness for even having a moment of doubt. I looked at her, really looked at her, noting the way she carefully kept her legs perfectly still under the heavy white duvet, playing the part of the shattered victim until the very end. Standing by the door was Dr. Sterling, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his face a mask of professional solemnity that couldn't quite hide the predatory gleam in his eyes as he watched that folder like a vulture watching a dying animal. He gave me a curt, encouraging nod, the kind of look a mentor gives a student who is finally doing the right thing, and he even had the audacity to clear his throat and remind me that time was of the essence for the next stage of Mia's recovery. I didn't say a word as I pulled the rolling tray table across her bed, the metal screeching slightly in the silent room. I opened the folder slowly, savoring the moment the trap was about to snap shut. Mia leaned forward as much as her injuries would allow, her breath hitching in anticipation of the deed that would sign over my parents' legacy to her gambling debts. But instead of the real estate contract or the bank transfer forms, I began to lay out the high-resolution stills Elias and Miller had prepared for me. The first photo showed Mia standing tall by the mini-fridge, a sandwich in one hand and a look of pure boredom on her face. The second showed her in a mid-air high-five with Derek, their faces lit up with the joy of a successful heist. The third was a close-up of her face as she laughed into her hidden cell phone, likely mocking the very man who was currently standing over her. The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like it was crushing the air out of the room. The color drained from Mia's face so fast I thought she might actually lose consciousness for real this time, her skin turning a sickly, translucent gray that matched the hospital walls. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out, no lies left to tell, no scripts left to read. I looked over at Dr. Sterling, whose arrogant posture had completely disintegrated into a slouch of pure, unadulterated panic as he realized his career, his reputation, and his freedom were evaporating in front of his eyes. Before Mia could utter a single syllable of a desperate explanation, I stepped back toward the door and gave a sharp nod to the two plainclothes detectives who had been waiting just out of sight in the hallway. They stepped in with the synchronized precision of a closing trap, their badges reflecting the harsh overhead lights. I looked Mia right in the eyes, stripping away every ounce of the love I once felt for her until there was nothing left but a cold, hard void. I told her that the marriage was over, that our life together was a fiction I was finally done reading, and that the only thing she'd be inheriting from me today was a prison cell and a lifetime of looking over her shoulder. The detectives didn't waste any time, moving past me to click the handcuffs around Dr. Sterling's wrists first, his expensive watch catching the light as his hands were forced behind his back. Then, they turned to the bed. In one fluid motion, the lead detective reached down and yanked the heavy blankets back, exposing the final, pathetic piece of the puzzle. Mia wasn't in a gown or even hospital socks. She was wearing a pair of expensive, brand-new sneakers, ready to bolt the second the money hit her account. The sight of those shoes, so clean and functional on the feet of a paralyzed woman, was the final nail in the coffin. Mia finally found her voice, but it wasn't the sweet, melodic tone I had fallen in love with. It was a jagged, hysterical scream that filled the room, a mixture of rage and terror as she realized the game was truly over. She started shrieking my name, begging me to listen, telling me she did it for us, that she was in over her head. But I didn't even flinch. I felt a strange, hollow sense of peace as I turned my back on the chaos, walking out of that room and down the long, sterile hallway for the last time. The sound of her screaming faded as the heavy fire doors swung shut behind me, replaced by the normal, everyday bustle of a hospital that was actually trying to save lives. I stepped out into the crisp, mid-morning air of the parking lot, the sun feeling warm on my face for the first time in weeks. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers steady and sure as I dialed my realtor's number. When he picked up, I didn't wait for a greeting. I just told him to take the house off the market immediately, that the sale was canceled and the property was no longer for negotiation. I looked up at the hospital windows, thinking about how close I had come to losing the only thing that connected me to my family, all for a woman who never truly existed. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying, a sense of reclamation that was more powerful than any grief. I walked toward my car, a man who had lost a wife but found his soul, ready to go back to the house my father built and start the long process of scrubbing the scent of her betrayal out of the floorboards. The story of our marriage was a tragedy, but the ending was mine to write. And as I drove away from that clinic, I knew the first chapter of my new life was going to be one of silence, success, and the absolute refusal to ever let a beautiful lie destroy a difficult truth again.